The humid July air clung to Solomon's skin as he straightened his back, carefully, deliberately, fighting the sharp pain that shot down his spine. 3 weeks had passed since he'd fallen from the cotton gin while making repairs, a task he'd been ordered to do, despite the rain that had made the wooden structure slippery and treacherous. At 32 years old, Solomon Reed had been considered one of the most valuable field hands on Thornhill Plantation, his strength and endurance legendary among the neighboring estates in northern Georgia. Now he was damaged goods. "You still ain't moving right," Master Thornhill said, watching Solomon from atop his chestnut mare. The plantation owner's face was flushed from the heat, his linen shirt sticking to his portly frame. "Carlisle's coming by tomorrow to look at you. If you can't work at full strength by harvest, we might have to make arrangements." Solomon knew what arrangements meant. He'd seen it happen to others, sold downriver to the brutal sugar plantations in Louisiana or to the rice fields of South Carolina where men died young from malaria and exhaustion. His stomach tightened as he nodded silently, eyes fixed on the ground. "Yes, Master Thornhill." "Get back to the lighter duties, and tell Esther to give you some of that liniment tonight." Solomon made his way slowly toward the tool shed, where he'd been assigned to repair hoes and shovels since his injury. Each step was a negotiation with pain. At the shed, Isaiah, an older man who'd been at Thornhill for longer than anyone could remember, glanced up from the scythe he was sharpening. "Master been talking about selling you?" he asked, his voice low. Solomon nodded, picking up a broken hoe handle. "Says Dr. Carlisle's coming to look me over tomorrow." Isaiah's weathered face betrayed nothing, but his hands paused their work. "That man sold more of us than the fever's taken. Don't let him see you hurting. Stand straight, no matter what it costs you." The two men worked in silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of Isaiah's whetstone against metal the only noise besides the distant singing from the fields. Solomon's thoughts drifted to Hannah and their 2 children, living on the neighboring Blackwood plantation. They'd been allowed to marry 5 years ago, with Solomon walking the 3 miles to see them on Saturday evenings, returning before dawn on Mondays. If he was sold south, he would never see them again. "There's talk," Isaiah finally said, breaking the silence, "of Union troops not far from here. Some say Lincoln's gonna free us all soon." Solomon had heard such talk before. Hope was dangerous on a plantation. It made people reckless, desperate. "Don't matter what Lincoln says if Master Thornhill won't hear it," he replied, focusing on fitting the new handle into the hoe's metal head. "Just saying, times might be changing. You hold on, Solomon. Find a way." That evening, in the cramped cabin he shared with 4 other men, Solomon lay on his thin straw mattress, staring at the ceiling as Esther, the plantation's cook and healer, rubbed pungent-smelling liniment into his lower back. "You got to stand straight tomorrow," she murmured, her fingers working deep into the knotted muscles. "Carlisle's looking for any reason to tell the master you ain't worth keeping." Solomon winced as she found a particularly tender spot. "I know. I put something extra in here to dull the pain for a few hours. It won't last long, but maybe long enough." Her voice dropped even lower. "Word is, Master's in trouble. Cotton prices dropped, and he owes money all over the county. He's looking to sell folks to cover his debts." This was new information, and it made Solomon's situation even more precarious. A desperate master was dangerous, unpredictable. "I'll stand straight," he promised. The next morning, Solomon woke before dawn, his back stiff and throbbing. He moved carefully, methodically stretching as Esther had shown him, feeling the vertebrae pop and shift. By the time the overseer's horn sounded, he'd managed to work some of the stiffness out, though the pain remained, a constant companion. Dr. Carlisle arrived mid-morning, his black medical bag in hand, his face already sheened with sweat under his wide-brimmed hat. He was not a real doctor, Not for people like Solomon. He was a livestock specialist who had expanded his practice to include examining slaves for purchase, sale, and occasionally treatment, if they were valuable enough. Solomon stood in Master Thornhill's office, a small room adjacent to the main house that smelled of tobacco and whiskey. Thornhill sat behind his desk, ledgers open before him, while Carlyle circled Solomon like a vulture. "Stripped to the waist," Carlyle ordered. Solomon removed his worn cotton shirt, exposing skin marked by years of fieldwork, old scars from whippings when he was younger and more defiant, muscles developed through endless labor. "Turn around," Solomon obeyed, focusing on standing perfectly straight despite the fire in his lower back. Esther's concoction was helping, but just barely. Carlyle's cold fingers probed the injured area, pressing hard enough to make Solomon bite the inside of his cheek to keep from flinching. Significant inflammation still present. How long ago was the fall? 3 weeks, give or take, Thornhill replied, not looking up from his ledgers, and he can't work the fields at all. Not properly, too slow, can't bend right. I've had him on tool repair. Carlyle stepped back, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. It's a spinal injury. Could heal completely in another month or two, or he could be permanently compromised. Hard to say. Thornhill finally looked up. So, what's he worth now? The question hung in the air, reducing Solomon's entire existence to a dollar amount. He kept his face impassive, though his heart hammered in his chest. "Well," Carlyle said thoughtfully, "given his age and the uncertainty of recovery, I'd say he's worth about half what you'd get for him healthy. Maybe $800 in the current market. $900 if you find a buyer who needs strong hands and is willing to wait out the recovery." Thornhill cursed under his breath, scribbling something in his ledger. "That's not enough. Paid $1,200 for him 10 years ago. Market's soft right now, James. Cotton prices have everyone cutting back." Solomon stood motionless, listening to his fate being decided as if he were a piece of furniture. His thoughts turned again to Hannah and the children. Their youngest, Sarah, had just turned 3. Would she even remember him if he was sold away? "What about the new plantation over in Alabama?" Thornhill asked. "Fairchild's place. He's buying up hands for that big expansion." Carlyle shook his head. "Fairchild wants prime field hands. Won't take damaged goods." He gestured towards Solomon. "You could try the auction in Atlanta next month. Might get a better price there." Thornhill sighed heavily. "Put your shirt back on," he told Solomon. "Get back to the tool shed." Solomon dressed quickly, careful not to show relief at the temporary reprieve, and left the room, catching just a snippet of Thornhill's next words. "Can't afford to keep him if he can't work the harvest." Outside, the July sun beat down mercilessly. Solomon made his way to the tool shed, where Isaiah waited expectantly. "Well?" the older man asked when Solomon entered. "They're talking about selling me at the Atlanta auction next month," Solomon replied, picking up a broken rake. "Master says he can't keep me if I can't work the harvest." Isaiah nodded slowly. "Harvest is 6 weeks away. A lot can happen in 6 weeks." That evening, as the enslaved workers ate their meager supper in the yard outside the kitchen, an unusual tension filled the air. Conversations were hushed, with frequent glances toward the big house. Solomon noticed several of the house servants speaking in urgent whispers, breaking apart whenever the overseer, Mr. Sims, walked by. Esther slipped him an extra piece of cornbread as she passed, murmuring, "Meet me behind the smokehouse after dark. Something you need to know." Solomon waited until the night was deep and the plantation quiet before making his way to the smokehouse, moving as silently as his injured back would allow. Esther was already there, a dark shape against the darker building. "Master got a letter today," she said without preamble. "His cousin up north wrote to tell him Union troops are moving this way. They're taking slaves as contraband of war, setting them free." Solomon's pulse quickened. How far away? Don't know exactly. But Master was in a state. Started talking about moving some of us to his brother's place in Texas before the Yankees get here. She paused. They're starting with the ones they think might run. Young men, mostly. And they're selling the ones they don't think can make the journey. Like me, Solomon said, understanding dawning. Like you, Esther agreed. Isaiah says there's a group planning to run when the troops get close enough. 3, maybe 4 weeks from now. Solomon shook his head. I can't run like this, he said, gesturing to his back. And I won't leave without trying to get to Hannah and the children. That's why I'm telling you now. You got time to heal more. Maybe send word to Hannah. Esther pressed something into his hand, a small cloth pouch. This is stronger medicine. Use it careful-like, only when the pain's too much to bear. Save your strength, Solomon. Times are changing. As Solomon made his way back to his cabin, the pouch hidden in his waistband, a new feeling stirred within him. Not quite hope, which was too dangerous to entertain fully, but something adjacent to it. A sense of possibility, however remote. The next day, word came that 3 slaves had escaped from the Mercer plantation 10 miles east. By evening, riders were passing through Thornhill, grim-faced men with dogs and guns, asking if anyone had seen the runaways. The mood among the enslaved darkened as they heard the baying of hounds in the distance. They won't make it, muttered Jacob, one of the men who shared Solomon's cabin, not with those dogs after them. Maybe they will, Isaiah said quietly. Maybe things are different now. 2 days later, the riders returned empty-handed, their dogs exhausted, their tempers short. The runaways had disappeared, seemingly into thin air. Rumors spread like wildfire. Union sympathizers helping escaped slaves, secret routes north, armed blacks fighting alongside Yankees not 100 miles away. Master Thornhill grew more agitated by the day, spending long hours in his office with the overseer and occasional visitors who arrived in expensive carriages, spoke in hushed tones, and left looking as troubled as they had arrived. Solomon continued his work in the toolshed, carefully rebuilding his strength. Esther's medicine helped, and each day the pain receded a little more. He began doing exercises in the pre-dawn darkness, careful stretches and controlled movements that Isaiah showed him, handed down from an African healer who had died before Solomon came to Thornhill. The body remembers how to heal itself, Isaiah told him. You just got to remind it. A week passed, then another. The Georgia summer reached its brutal peak, the heat so intense that even Master Thornhill ordered a reduction in fieldwork during midday hours. In the relative privacy of the toolshed, Solomon tested his back, lifting increasingly heavy loads, bending to touch his toes, twisting from side to side. The pain was still there, but it was changing, becoming duller, more manageable. And then everything changed. It began with a distant rumble like summer thunder, but continuous, growing louder. The field hands paused in their work, looking toward the sound. On the horizon, a cloud of dust rose, moving steadily closer to Thornhill Plantation. "Riders coming," shouted the lookout from the edge of the cotton field. Mr. Sims galloped out to meet the approaching group, returning minutes later at full speed. He dismounted at the big house in a cloud of dust, running inside without bothering to tie up his horse. Solomon and Isaiah exchanged glances from the door of the tool shed. "What is it?" Solomon asked. Isaiah's expression was unreadable. "Change," he said simply. "Change is coming." Minutes later, Master Thornhill burst from the house, his face ashen. He began shouting orders. Slaves were to be gathered at the main barn, tools locked away, wagons prepared. Something was happening, something that had struck fear into the heart of their owner. As the enslaved workers were herded toward the barn, confused and apprehensive, Solomon caught fragments of conversation between Thornhill and Sims. At least 50 riders, flying the Union flag, proclamation of emancipation, confiscating property. The word sent a jolt through Solomon's body. Could it be true? Was freedom actually approaching Thornhill Plantation? In the barn, Master Thornhill stood on an upturned barrel, his usually florid face now pale, sweat staining his fine shirt. "Listen carefully," he shouted over the murmuring crowd. "There are Union soldiers approaching. They may try to tell you that you're free, that you can leave. This is a lie. President Lincoln has no authority in Georgia." He paused, seeming to gather himself. "Anyone who runs to them will be hunted down when they leave, which they will. The Confederacy will prevail. Those who stay loyal will be rewarded. Those who betray this plantation—" He left the threat unfinished. A tense silence filled the barn. Solomon could feel the collective breath being held, the weight of centuries of oppression suddenly pressing against the possibility of its end. Master Thornhill continued, his voice regaining some of its usual authority. "The strongest men will come with me and Mr. Sims to my brother's plantation in Texas. We leave tonight. The rest of you will remain here under the supervision of my son Thomas until this situation resolves itself." Solomon felt a hand grip his arm. Isaiah, his eyes wide with urgency. "They're running," the older man whispered. "Tonight's the night." As Master Thornhill read out the names of those selected to go to Texas, Solomon made his decision. Whatever happened, he would not be separated further from Hannah and his children. He would not go to Texas, and he would not stay at Thornhill to be sold when the Union troops moved on. Despite his back, despite the danger, he would run. Not north with the others, but east to Blackwood Plantation. Tonight, one way or another, he would be free. Twilight descended over Thornhill Plantation like a heavy curtain, bringing with it an unusual stillness. The normal evening activities, cooking, washing, mending, had been disrupted by Master Thornhill's announcement. Now small groups of enslaved workers huddled together, whispering urgently, casting frequent glances toward the big house where lanterns burned in every window. In the cramped space behind the tool shed, Solomon met with Isaiah and 5 others who planned to flee that night. Jacob, the youngest at 19, paced nervously while Esther distributed small bundles of food. Cornbread, dried meat, and a few precious apples stolen from the kitchen stores. Union soldiers are camped at the Miller Creek crossing, about 7 miles northwest, Isaiah explained, his voice barely above a whisper. According to what the house girl Rachel overheard, they're moving through the county, reading out Lincoln's proclamation and taking freed people under their protection. "What about the patrols?" asked Daniel, a field hand known for his caution. "And the dogs?" "Master's taken most of the dogs with him for the Texas group," Esther said, "and half the white men in the county are either gone to war or scrambling to protect their own property from the Yankees." Solomon adjusted the small pack he'd prepared, wincing slightly as he slung it across his still tender back. "I'm not going to Miller Creek," he reminded them. "I'm heading to Blackwood for Hannah and the children." Isaiah nodded gravely. "That's 3 miles east. You'll be going opposite from us and the soldiers." "We'll meet at the old Baptist church north of Blackwood," Solomon said. "Hannah knows the place. We used to meet there sometimes before we were allowed to marry." Daniel shook his head. "It's too dangerous." Master Blackwood might have heard the same news. He could be moving his people too, or watching for runaways. "I'm not leaving without my family." Solomon's voice was quiet, but firm. "I'll deal with whatever comes." Esther pressed a small object into Solomon's hand, a crude compass fashioned from a magnetized needle floating in a tiny gourd filled with water. "Keep the North Star on your right as you head to Blackwood. If you get turned around, this will help." The group fell silent as footsteps approached the tool shed. They tensed, ready to scatter, but it was only Rachel, her young face tight with urgency. "They're loading the wagons now," she whispered. "Master's taking 20 men with him. The rest are being locked in the barn for the night. Under guard. You need to move soon before they start counting heads." Isaiah clasped Solomon's shoulder. "God go with you, brother. Find your family." Solomon nodded, emotion making it hard to speak. These people had been his only community for 10 years. "And with you, I'll see you at the church." As darkness fully enveloped the plantation, the group dispersed, moving silently through the shadows toward the edges of the property. Solomon headed east, keeping low among the cotton plants, his back protesting but holding. He'd taken a small dose of Esther's medicine, enough to dull the pain without clouding his mind. The night was mercifully cloudy, limiting visibility for any potential pursuers, but also making navigation more challenging. Solomon kept the waning moon on his left as best he could, moving steadily through fields and woodland. Every sound, an owl's call, the rustle of leaves, distant voices, sent his heart racing. Discovery meant certain death now. Master Thornhill would make an example of any runaway caught during this chaos. After an hour of careful progress, Solomon reached Crow Creek, the boundary between Thornhill and the neighboring Watson property. He paused to drink and refill his water gourd, listening intently to the night sounds. In the distance, he could hear dogs barking and men shouting, whether Confederate patrols or Union soldiers. He couldn't tell. The creek was wider than usual from recent rains, its currents swift and dark. Solomon waded across carefully, using a fallen branch for support, the cold water soothing his aching muscles. On the far bank, he rested briefly, adjusting his mental map. Blackwood Plantation lay another hour's journey through increasingly unfamiliar territory. As he continued east, Solomon's thoughts turned to Hannah. They had met at a corn husking 7 years ago, when Master Thornhill had brought some of his people to help with Blackwood's harvest. Hannah's quiet strength and gentle humor had drawn him immediately. For 2 years, they had conducted a courtship through rare permitted visits and messages carried by traveling preachers or trusted house servants who moved between plantations. When permission to marry was finally granted, primarily because both masters saw the economic benefit of potentially producing more enslaved workers, it had been the happiest day of Solomon's life. Even the restrictive conditions of their marriage, living separately, limited to weekend visits, couldn't diminish their joy at creating a family together. Now their daughter Sarah was 3, their son James 5. Solomon had last seen them 2 weeks ago, before the rumors of approaching Union troops had led to a ban on interplantation visits. Hannah would be expecting him this Saturday, not tonight. Would she be ready to flee at a moment's notice? Would she believe that freedom was finally within reach? Solomon's thoughts were interrupted by the unmistakable sound of horses on the road ahead. He dropped to the ground, crawling into a dense thicket of blackberry brambles, ignoring the thorns that tore at his clothes and skin. Through the tangled branches, he could make out the silhouettes of mounted men moving slowly along the dirt road, lanterns swinging from their saddles, casting eerie pools of light on the dusty surface. "Check the Jenkins place next," one rider was saying as they passed Solomon's hiding place. "Then swing back toward Blackwood. Thornhill said they'd be heading for Union lines, but some might try for family at other plantations." Solomon's breath caught in his throat. They were looking for runaways, and they were heading toward Blackwood. If he continued on his planned route, he might lead them straight to Hannah. He remained motionless until the patrol had passed, then altered his course, moving deeper into the woods, away from the road. It would take longer, but he couldn't risk bringing danger to his family's doorstep. The forest grew denser, the going slower. Twice Solomon had to stop and consult Esther's makeshift compass, worried he'd become disoriented in the darkness. His back throbbed steadily now, the medicine wearing off, but he pushed on, driven by a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Finally, close to midnight, Solomon reached the edge of the Blackwood cotton fields. He crouched at the tree line, studying the layout of the plantation in the dim moonlight. Unlike Thornhill's imposing white-columned mansion, the Blackwood house was a more modest, two-story structure. The slave quarters, 12 small cabins arranged in 2 neat rows, stood about 100 yards from the main house. Hannah and the children lived in the 3rd cabin from the end, sharing the space with an elderly couple and 2 unmarried women. Solomon had to reach her without alerting anyone. Not the White family, not the overseer who lived in a small house near the stables, not even the other enslaved people who might raise an alarm out of fear or misguided loyalty. Moving silently along the edge of the field, Solomon circled around to approach the cabins from behind. No dogs barked, which struck him as unusual. Blackwood typically kept at least 2 hounds that would alert at any strange presence. Perhaps they too had been taken by patrols, searching for runaways. As he drew closer to Hannah's cabin, Solomon could see a single candle burning in the window. Another anomaly. Candles were precious commodities, rarely allowed to burn after dark, unless someone was ill. A sense of unease prickled at the back of Solomon's neck. Something wasn't right. He crept to the rear window of the cabin, peering cautiously inside. Hannah sat at the small table, fully dressed despite the late hour, her hands busy with mending work. The children were nowhere to be seen, though they should have been asleep on their pallets in the corner. Solomon tapped gently on the window frame, their old signal, 3 quick taps followed by 2 slow ones. Hannah's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear that quickly transformed into shock when she saw him. She glanced nervously toward the cabin door, then back at Solomon, shaking her head slightly. The warning was clear. Danger. Solomon retreated into the shadows as the cabin door opened. A white man stepped out, not Master Blackwood, but someone Solomon didn't recognize. The stranger stood on the small porch, scanning the darkness, one hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Something wrong?" the man called back into the cabin. Hannah's voice drifted out, carefully controlled. "Just the wind rattling the shutters, sir. I'll secure them." The man stood for another long moment, then grunted and went back inside. Solomon remained frozen in his hiding place, mind racing. Who was this man? Why was he in Hannah's cabin at midnight? And most importantly, where were his children? He waited, barely breathing, for nearly half an hour before the cabin door opened again. This time, Hannah emerged alone, a wooden bucket in hand, presumably to fetch water from the nearby well, a common enough task that wouldn't arouse suspicion. As she passed near his hiding place, Solomon made the softest of whistling sounds, like a whippoorwill, another of their signals. Hannah didn't break stride, but whispered as she passed, "Slave trader, buying for Texas, children hidden at Bessie's cabin, meet at the old oak behind the smithy." She continued toward the well, her posture giving no indication of the earth-shattering exchange that had just occurred. Solomon processed her words with growing horror. A slave trader here at Blackwood, tonight of all nights. Was it coincidence, or had the same rumors of approaching Union troops prompted Master Blackwood to sell off valuable property before they could be confiscated by Northern forces? Solomon retreated, circling around to the massive oak tree behind the plantation's small blacksmith shop. The smithy was dark and silent at this hour, providing good cover. He waited, heart pounding, for what seemed an eternity before Hannah appeared, moving quickly and silently through the shadows. When she reached him, they embraced fiercely, desperately, all the fear and longing of their separation pouring into the contact. "Solomon," she breathed against his neck. "What are you doing here? It's not safe. There are patrols everywhere." "Union soldiers are near," he whispered back. "People are running. Isaiah, Esther, others from Thornhill. We can be free, Hannah. Tonight." She pulled back, searching his face in the darkness. "Free? Truly free." Lincoln's proclamation. The Yankees are enforcing it, taking freed people under their protection. He squeezed her hands. "We have to go now, while there's confusion. Where are James and Sarah? Bessie took them to her cabin when the trader came. Said they were her sister's children from the Wilkins place. Hannah's voice trembled. He's already bought 6 people, Solomon. Mostly young men, but Martha's oldest girl too. They're chained in the tobacco barn, leaving at first light. Solomon's jaw tightened. We'll get the children and go tonight. There's a meeting place, the old Baptist church north of here. Others will be there waiting to travel together to the Union lines. Hannah nodded, her decision made. I'll get them now. Wait here. Be careful, Solomon caught her arm. There are riders on the roads looking for runaways. I know these grounds better than my own face, Hannah assured him. I'll be back with our babies before you know it. As Hannah slipped away toward the cabins, Solomon scanned their surroundings, planning their escape route. They would need to move northwest from Blackwood, avoiding the roads, aiming for the abandoned church about 5 miles away. With the children through unfamiliar woodland at night, it would be slow going, especially with his back still not fully healed. 20 anxious minutes passed before Hannah returned, a child's hand in each of hers. James, at 5, walked silently beside his mother, eyes wide and alert. Sarah, barely awake, was wrapped in a shawl against the night chill. "Papa!" James whispered excitedly when he saw Solomon. Starting forward before Hannah's restraining hand stopped him, Solomon knelt, embracing both children carefully, fighting back tears. "We have to be very quiet," he whispered, "like playing hide and seek. Can you do that for Papa?" Both children nodded solemnly, sensing the gravity of the situation despite their young age. Even at 5 and 3, they had already learned the survival skill of absolute silence when necessary. "I brought what I could," Hannah said, indicating the small bundle secured to her back. "Food, an extra blanket, the children's shoes." Solomon nodded appreciatively. "We need to move now. Stay off the roads." As they prepared to leave the relative safety of the oak tree's shadow, a shout rang out from the direction of the slave cabins, followed by the sudden flaring of lanterns. "They've discovered someone missing," Hannah whispered, clutching the children closer. "This way!" Solomon led them quickly behind the smithy, then along the edge of the sorghum field that bordered the western side of the plantation. They moved as silently as possible, Solomon carrying Sarah, Hannah holding tightly to James's hand. Behind them, the commotion grew. More shouts, doors slamming, the sound of horses being readied. The plantation was waking, the alarm spreading. "The creek!" Hannah panted as they reached the end of the field. "We can follow it north, stay in the water to hide our scent if they bring dogs." Solomon nodded grimly. The water would be cold, the current potentially dangerous for the children. But Hannah was right. It was their best chance of evading pursuit. They reached the narrow creek that marked Blackwood's western boundary and waded in carefully, the children whimpering softly at the shock of the cold water. "Shh, it's all right," Hannah soothed. "Just a little adventure. We're going to a special place." "Where, Mama?" James asked, his small voice trembling. Hannah exchanged a glance with Solomon before answering. "To freedom, baby. We're going to freedom." They moved upstream, staying in the shallow water near the bank, progress painfully slow. Solomon's back screamed in protest at carrying Sarah while navigating the slippery creek bed, but he pushed the pain aside, focusing only on putting distance between his family and danger. After nearly an hour in the water, they climbed out onto the northern bank, all 4 of them shivering despite the summer night's warmth. In the distance, they could still hear sporadic shouts and the faint baying of dogs. The search was underway. "We need to move faster," Solomon said, helping James climb up the steep bank. "The church is still 3 miles away." Hannah nodded, taking Sarah from him to give his back a respite. "The old logging trail should be just beyond that ridge. It's overgrown, but faster than pushing through the underbrush." They found the abandoned trail, little more than a narrow track now, partially reclaimed by the forest. Still, it allowed them to move more quickly, the dense canopy overhead hiding them from the moonlight. James trudged bravely alongside Solomon, occasionally stumbling with exhaustion, but never complaining. Sarah had fallen asleep on Hannah's shoulder, her small body limp with the deep slumber of childhood. "Solomon," Hannah whispered as they paused to rest briefly, "if we're caught—" "We won't be," he interrupted firmly. "But if we are—" Inda, she persisted, "promise me you'll run. Get to the Union soldiers. At least one of us needs to be free to come back for the others somehow." Solomon shook his head. "I won't leave you. Any of you." Hannah's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Our children need at least one parent to survive this night." Before Solomon could respond, the unmistakable sound of a dog's bark echoed through the forest, closer than he'd expected, perhaps half a mile behind them. "They're on our trail," he said urgently, helping Hannah to her feet. "We need to move. Now." They abandoned the path, cutting directly northwest through the woods, Solomon carrying James now, whose small legs couldn't match the pace they needed to maintain. The terrain grew rougher, the forest denser. Twice they had to backtrack around impassable thickets or steep ravines. The sounds of pursuit grew steadily closer, dogs baying with increasing excitement as they followed the family's scent, men shouting to each other as they closed in. "There!" Hannah gasped, pointing ahead. "I can see the church steeple." Sure enough, through a break in the trees, the dilapidated spire of the old Baptist church was visible against the night sky. Solomon felt a surge of hope. Isaiah and the others might already be there, safety in numbers, perhaps even weapons to defend themselves. They pushed forward with renewed energy, the children sensing their parents' urgency and remaining miraculously quiet despite their fear and exhaustion. Just as the church clearing came into view, Solomon heard the unmistakable sound of horses approaching from the north, directly in their path. He pulled Hannah and the children down into a dense patch of underbrush, holding them close as riders passed barely 20 yards away, torches illuminating their grim faces. "More patrols," Solomon whispered, once they had passed. "They've got the church surrounded." Hannah's face, visible in the faint pre-dawn light, now filtering through the trees, was a mask of determination despite her fear. "What do we do?" Solomon surveyed their surroundings, mind racing. Behind them, the dogs and searchers from Blackwood were closing in. Ahead, mounted patrols circled the church, where he had hoped to find sanctuary with the other runaways. They were trapped between two forces, with exhausted children and nowhere to hide. "The Miller Creek camp," he said finally, "where the Union soldiers are. It's northwest from here, maybe 4 miles. Hannah's eyes widened. 4 miles? The children can't— "They have to." Solomon cut her off gently. "It's our only chance now." As if to emphasize his point, a dog barked much closer than before, followed by a man's shout, "Over here! Fresh tracks!" They ran then, all pretense of stealth abandoned in the face of imminent capture. Solomon carried James, Hannah carried Sarah, both children now fully awake and terrified, but somehow understanding enough to remain silent. The forest blurred around them as they fled northwest, guided by the rising sun. Solomon's back was on fire, muscles screaming with every step, but fear and desperation drove him forward. Hannah kept pace beside him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew ever closer, dogs in full cry now, men shouting in triumph as they closed the gap. Ahead lay unknown territory and the distant hope of Union protection. As they crested a small rise, Solomon caught a glimpse of water through the trees, a wide creek, much larger than the one they'd followed earlier. Miller Creek. It had to be. And if the information was correct, Union forces were camped somewhere along its banks. "Just a little further," he encouraged Hannah, who was stumbling with exhaustion. "Water ahead." But as they started down the slope toward the creek, disaster struck. Hannah's foot caught on an exposed root, sending her and Sarah tumbling forward. Hannah managed to twist her body to protect the child, taking the brunt of the fall on her right side. She cried out in pain, clutching at her ankle. Solomon turned back, heart sinking as he saw Hannah trying unsuccessfully to stand. "It's broken," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I can't walk." Behind them, the baying of the hounds grew louder, triumphant now as they followed the fresh scent. They had minutes at most before their pursuers would be upon them. Hannah looked up at Solomon, her expression transforming from pain to resolute clarity. "Take the children," she said firmly. "Go now. I'll draw them off." "No," Solomon protested. "I won't leave you." "You must," Hannah insisted, struggling to her feet, putting no weight on her injured ankle. "For James and Sarah. Get them to safety. I'll be right behind you." They both knew it was a lie. If Hannah was caught, she would face the lash at best, sale and permanent separation from her family at worst. But her eyes, locked with Solomon's, contained no fear, only love and fierce determination. "Go," she repeated, taking a small knife from her bundle, a kitchen knife she had hidden away months ago. "I'll find you. I promise." Solomon stood frozen, torn between impossible choices as the sounds of pursuit grew ever closer. "Papa, please." James tugged at his hand, his young face streaked with tears but resolute. "Mama says go." In that moment, seeing his son's courage, Solomon made the hardest decision of his life. He pulled Hannah into a desperate embrace, kissed her deeply one last time, and whispered, "I'll come back for you. Wait for me." Then, carrying Sarah and pulling James by the hand, Solomon ran toward the creek, toward the hope of freedom, leaving his heart behind with the brave woman who was already limping in the opposite direction, drawing their pursuers away from her family with the last gift she could give them: freedom. Solomon realized as he plunged into the cold waters of Miller Creek was not just the absence of chains. It was also this terrible burden of choice, the devastating price of determining your own fate, and sometimes the fates of those you love most. The cold water of Miller Creek shocked Solomon back to full alertness, washing away the fog of exhaustion that had been creeping over him. James gasped beside him, his small hand clutching Solomon's with surprising strength. Sarah, still in his arms, buried her face against his neck, her tiny body trembling. "It's all right," Solomon murmured, though nothing was all right. Hannah was behind them, sacrificing herself to save them. The knowledge tore at him like physical pain, worse than his injured back, worse than anything he'd ever experienced. They waded into the creek, the water rising to Solomon's waist at its deepest point. He lifted James onto his hip alongside Sarah, ignoring the searing protest from his spine. The current was strong, but not dangerous, pulling them slightly downstream as they crossed. Halfway across, Solomon paused, listening intently. The sounds of pursuit had changed. The dog's baying was moving away, following Hannah's trail as she'd intended. But mixed with those familiar sounds came something new. Distant shouts that didn't sound like plantation overseers or slave catchers, and what might have been the rhythmic tramp of many feet moving in unison. "Papa, look," James whispered, pointing north along the creek. Solomon turned, his heart leaping. About a quarter-mile upstream on the far bank, tents were visible through the trees, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows. Men in blue uniforms moved among them, and a flag, unmistakably the Stars and Stripes, flew from a central pole, the Union camp. They had found it, but between them and salvation lay an open stretch of bank with no cover, clearly visible to anyone pursuing them. And despite Hannah's diversion, Solomon could hear at least one dog still on their trail, growing closer. "We have to run," he told James, setting the boy down on the far bank. "Can you run with me, as fast as you can?" James nodded solemnly, his young face set with determination beyond his years. With Sarah still in his arms, Solomon took James's hand and they broke from the cover of the creek, running across the open ground toward the Union camp. Solomon's lungs burned, his back a riot of pain, but fear and hope drove him forward. 20 yards, 50, the camp growing closer with each desperate step. Behind them a shout went up. "There, by the creek!" Solomon didn't look back, couldn't afford to. He tightened his grip on James's hand and pushed harder, faster. A gunshot cracked through the morning air, the bullet whining past them to thud into a tree ahead. Another shot, closer. Solomon zigzagged instinctively, pulling James with him, making them harder targets. "Help!" he shouted toward the camp, his voice hoarse with exertion. "Help us!" Whether they heard him or the gunshots, the camp suddenly erupted into activity. Blue uniformed soldiers grabbed rifles, officers shouted orders, and a group of mounted men spurred their horses toward Solomon and the children. Another shot from behind, and Solomon felt a searing pain across his upper arm. He stumbled but didn't fall, regaining his balance and pushing onward. The Union cavalry was closing the distance rapidly, but so were their pursuers. "Halt!" a voice bellowed from behind. "That's stolen property! We have rights!" The Union riders reached Solomon first, forming a protective barrier between the fleeing family and their hunters. A young officer with Lieutenant's bars dismounted, his face grim but kind as he approached Solomon, who had finally stopped, gasping for breath, the children clinging to him. "You're safe now," the lieutenant said, eyeing Solomon's bleeding arm. "Are you from a nearby plantation?" Solomon nodded, unable to speak yet, his chest heaving. The lieutenant turned to face the slave catchers, who had reined in their horses at the sight of armed federal troops. There were 4 of them, led by a red-faced overseer Solomon didn't recognize, presumably from Blackwood. "These people are free under President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation," the lieutenant called out. "They're under United States military protection now." "Like hell they are," the overseer snarled. "Georgia's Confederate territory. Your proclamation means nothing here. That's Blackwood property, and we're taking it back." The lieutenant's expression hardened. "You're welcome to file a complaint with the commanding officer, but these people aren't going anywhere with you. Now I suggest you turn around before this becomes unpleasant." The standoff stretched for several tense seconds before the overseer spat on the ground. "This ain't over," he growled, wheeling his horse around. "Blackwood won't stand for this thievery." The slave catchers retreated, casting murderous glances over their shoulders. Solomon watched them go, hardly daring to believe this reprieve was real. "Thank you," he managed finally, looking at the lieutenant. "My wife, she's still out there. They were chasing her. She's hurt." The officer's expression softened with concern. "Where?" "Southeast of here. She diverted them so we could escape. Her ankle's broken." The lieutenant nodded to one of his men. "Corporal Jenkins, take a squad and search the area southeast of our position. Look for a wounded Negro woman being pursued." He turned back to Solomon. "We'll find her if we can. Meanwhile, let's get you and these little ones to camp. That arm needs attention, and you all look dead on your feet." As they walked toward the camp, James tugging at Solomon's hand, the boy asked in a small voice, "Will the soldiers find Mama?" Solomon swallowed hard, forcing confidence into his voice. "They'll try their best, son. Your Mama is smart and brave. If anyone can find a way, it's her." At the camp, a surgeon cleaned and bandaged Solomon's arm. The bullet had only grazed him, tearing flesh but hitting no vital structures. The children were given food and warm blankets, Sarah falling asleep almost immediately after eating. Solomon learned they had reached the 10th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, part of a Union force moving through northern Georgia on reconnaissance. Their commanding officer, a Colonel Harmon, had been authorized to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation in Confederate territory, accepting escaped slaves as contraband of war and offering military protection. "We've gathered about 60 formerly enslaved people in the past week," explained the lieutenant, whose name was Wilson. most from plantations within 15 miles of here. We're escorting them north to Chattanooga, where there's a larger contraband camp with better facilities." "When do you move out?" Solomon asked, his mind still on Hannah. "Tomorrow morning. Colonel wants to gather as many people as we can before we head north." Lieutenant Wilson hesitated. "The search party should be back by nightfall. If they find your wife—" Solomon nodded gratefully, though anxiety gnawed at him. Every passing hour decreased the chances of finding Hannah alive and free. As afternoon faded toward evening, more escaped slaves trickled into the camp, some alone, others in small groups. Solomon recognized Isaiah and Jacob among them, their faces lighting with surprise and joy when they saw him. "Solomon!" Isaiah embraced him carefully, mindful of his injured arm. "We feared the worst when you didn't meet us at the church. The patrols were everywhere. We barely made it through." "Hannah?" Jacob asked, looking around. Solomon's expression told them everything. "They're searching for her," he said quietly. "She drew the pursuers away so the children and I could escape." Isaiah's weathered face creased with sorrow and understanding. "That sounds like Hannah. She always had more courage than sense." As they talked, a commotion arose at the camp's southern perimeter. Solomon turned to see the search party returning, soldiers dismounting wearily from their horses. His heart leaped, then plummeted as he scanned their ranks and saw no sign of Hannah. Lieutenant Wilson approached, his expression grave. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "We found signs of pursuit, tracks, disturbed ground, but no sign of your wife." The trail led back toward Blackwood Plantation. The words hit Solomon like physical blows. Hannah recaptured. Hannah back at Blackwood, facing punishment, perhaps already sold to the Texas-bound trader. Hannah lost to him, perhaps forever. He nodded numbly, unable to speak. James, who had been playing with other refugee children nearby, ran to his father, sensing his distress. "Did they find Mama?" he asked, his young face hopeful. Solomon knelt, gathering his son close. "Not yet, James, not yet." That night, around one of the many campfires, Solomon sat with Isaiah and other refugees from surrounding plantations, sharing information and stories as the children slept nearby under makeshift shelters. "Union forces have taken most of northern Georgia," reported a man named Moses, who had escaped from a plantation near Atlanta. "The Confederacy is falling back, burning crops and bridges as they go. It won't be long before this whole state is under federal control." "What happens to us then?" asked a young woman cradling an infant. "Where do we go? What do we do?" Isaiah spoke up, his deep voice resonant in the firelit darkness. "We'll be truly free. Free to work for wages, to live where we choose, to keep our families together, free to learn reading and writing without fear of the lash." The words hung in the air, almost too enormous to comprehend after lifetimes of bondage. Solomon listened silently, his heart too heavy for hope. What was freedom worth without Hannah to share it? How could he raise two young children alone in a world he barely understood himself? And how could he leave Georgia knowing she remained in chains? As if reading his thoughts, Isaiah placed a hand on Solomon's shoulder. "We'll find a way to get her back," the older man promised quietly. "Once we're established somewhere safe for the children, we'll find a way." Solomon nodded, wanting to believe it but knowing the odds. If Hannah had been sold to the Texas trader, finding her could be nearly impossible. And even if she remained at Blackwood, reaching her would mean returning to Confederate territory, risking recapture or worse. "Get some rest," Isaiah advised. "Tomorrow brings the first day of your children's freedom. They'll need their father strong." Morning dawned clear and bright, the Union camp already buzzing with activity as soldiers prepared for the march north. The contraband group, now numbering close to 70 men, women and children from various plantations, gathered their meager possessions, faces showing a mixture of fear and hope at the prospect of the journey ahead. Solomon dressed the children in their cleanest clothes, combed their hair with his fingers, and tried to explain what was happening. "We're going north," he told them as they ate the hardtack and dried beef provided by the Union cooks, "to a place where we can be free." "Will Mama meet us there?" Sarah asked, her first words since they had fled Blackwood. Solomon swallowed hard. "I hope so, sweetheart. We'll pray for that every day." As the refugees formed into a column for the march, flanked by Union cavalry for protection, Solomon caught sight of a disturbance at the camp's edge. A small group of civilians was approaching under a white flag, 3 men on horseback, well dressed in the manner of plantation owners. Colonel Harmon, a stern-faced man with a salt-and-pepper beard, rode out to meet them, accompanied by 2 officers. The contraband column halted, watching anxiously as the meeting unfolded. "What's happening?" Solomon asked Lieutenant Wilson, who was overseeing their section of the column. "Plantation owners wanting to negotiate, most likely," Wilson replied grimly. "They've been showing up every day, demanding the return of their property. Colonel always refuses, but they keep trying." Solomon strained to see the visitors more clearly, his heart nearly stopping when he recognized one of them. Master Blackwood himself, his distinctive tall frame and black coat unmistakable even at this distance. "That's Blackwood," Solomon murmured to Isaiah. "Hannah's master." Isaiah's expression darkened. "Nothing good comes of that man showing his face here." The meeting appeared tense but civil, Colonel Harmon shaking his head repeatedly as Blackwood gesticulated emphatically. Finally, after about 10 minutes, the plantation owners turned their horses to leave, but not before Blackwood stood in his stirrups, scanning the contraband column as if searching for familiar faces. Solomon instinctively stepped back, shielding the children with his body, but not before Blackwood's gaze landed on him. Even across the distance, Solomon could feel the hatred in that stare, the promise of retribution. "He knows we're here," Solomon whispered. "Doesn't matter," Isaiah responded firmly. "He can't touch us now." The column resumed its march northward, moving at a pace the youngest and oldest could maintain. James walked beside Solomon, while Sarah alternated between walking and being carried. Both children were subdued, missing their mother but somehow understanding the gravity of their journey. As they left the camp, Solomon cast one last look southward, toward Blackwood, toward Hannah. "I'll come back for you," he promised silently, "however long it takes." The first day's march covered only about 10 miles. The column, stopping early to make camp as many of the refugees were unused to such prolonged exertion. Union soldiers showed them how to set up simple shelters using blankets and branches, built fires for cooking, and distributed rations. That evening, as darkness fell over their makeshift camp, Lieutenant Wilson sought out Solomon. Before they left, "One of the plantation owners mentioned your wife," he said without preamble. "I thought you should know." Solomon's heart raced. "Is she alive? Is she still at Blackwood?" Wilson nodded. "According to them, yes to both. She was recaptured about a mile from where you separated. Her ankle is indeed broken, but she's being treated by their doctor." He hesitated. "They're using her as bait, Solomon. They think you'll try to come back for her." "They're right," Solomon said simply. Wilson's expression grew stern. "That would be suicide. They're watching for you specifically. Blackwood has offered a substantial reward for your capture." "She's my wife," Solomon replied, as if that explained everything, which to him it did. "Your children need their father," Wilson countered. "If you're captured or killed trying to rescue her, what becomes of them?" The question struck Solomon like a physical blow. He glanced toward where James and Sarah slept, exhausted from the day's journey. "I can't just abandon her," he said finally, his voice breaking. Wilson sighed. "No one's asking you to, but rushing back half-cocked will only get you both killed or re-enslaved. Wait, get your children safely to Chattanooga. The war is turning in our favor. Within months, perhaps weeks, federal forces will control this entire region. When that happens, all slaves in Confederate territory will be legally free." Solomon wanted to believe it, but doubt gnawed at him. How many promises of freedom had been made to his people over the centuries, only to be broken or perverted? How many families had been permanently separated by the cruel mechanics of slavery, never to be reunited despite the best intentions? "What if she's sold before then?" he asked. "The trader was buying for Texas." Wilson's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I wish I could promise you that won't happen, but rushing back now alone, against armed men watching specifically for you, that's certain death or capture. At least this way, you and your children have freedom, and from freedom, there's hope of reuniting your family someday." Solomon knew the lieutenant was right, but the knowledge did nothing to ease the ache in his heart. That night, he lay awake long after the camp had quieted, staring at the stars and thinking of Hannah, wondering if she could see the same stars from wherever she was being held at Blackwood. The march resumed at dawn, the column pushing northward through increasingly mountainous terrain. By midday of the second day, they had left Georgia behind, crossing into Tennessee. The mood among the refugees lifted noticeably at this milestone. They were now in a state controlled primarily by Union forces, their freedom more secure with each mile. Solomon walked mechanically, carrying Sarah when she tired, encouraging James when his little legs grew weary, but his mind remained with Hannah. He replayed their last moments together constantly, her fall, her fierce determination as she urged him to take the children to safety, their final kiss. Had he made the right choice in leaving her? Could he have somehow carried all three of them to freedom? On the third day, as they approached Chattanooga, scout riders brought news that a Confederate cavalry unit had been spotted shadowing their column from a distance. "They won't attack a force this size," Colonel Harmon assured the anxious refugees, "but stay close together. We're less than a day's march from safety." That night, Solomon was awakened by a hand covering his mouth. He jerked upright, reaching instinctively for his children, only to find Isaiah crouched beside him. "Quiet," the older man whispered, removing his hand. "We need to talk, away from little ears." Checking that James and Sarah were still sleeping soundly, Solomon followed Isaiah to the edge of their small camp, well away from the Union sentries. "What is it?" Solomon asked. Isaiah's face was grave in the moonlight. "I overheard the officers talking. The Confederates following us. They're not just any unit. They're specifically after the runaways from Blackwood and Thornhill." Solomon's blood ran cold. How would they know which ones we are in this crowd? "They have descriptions, names." Isaiah paused. "And they have Hannah with them." The world seemed to tilt under Solomon's feet. "Hannah? With Confederate cavalry? How? Why?" "As bait, most likely, or to identify us." Isaiah gripped Solomon's shoulder. "If they catch up to us before we reach Chattanooga, they'll try to take us. You, me, the children, anyone from those two plantations." Solomon's mind raced. "We need to warn the colonel." "Already done. He's doubling the guards tonight and pushing for an early start tomorrow. But there's something else." Isaiah hesitated, then continued. "This might be your only chance to get Hannah back." Solomon stared at him. "What do you mean?" "If she's with them, and they attack or parley with our column, you could reach her. Once we're in Chattanooga, she'll be taken back south, maybe sold to Texas after all." Hope and fear warred in Solomon's chest. "The children, I'll watch over them," Isaiah promised. Get them safely to Chattanooga if anything happens to you. Raise them as my own if need be. Solomon was silent for a long moment, weighing impossible choices. Tell me what you're thinking, he finally said. The Confederate force is small, maybe 20 riders. They'll likely try to overtake us tomorrow before we reach the Union fortifications at Chattanooga. When they do, there will be confusion, negotiations. Isaiah met Solomon's eyes steadily. It might be your only chance to get to Hannah. And if I fail, if I'm captured instead, then the children at least remain free, with me to look after them. Isaiah's voice grew softer. I know it's an impossible choice, Solomon, but I thought you should know all the facts before tomorrow comes. Solomon nodded, his throat tight. Thank you. I need to think. He returned to his sleeping children, watching their peaceful faces in the dim light of the dying campfire. James had Solomon's own strong features, while Sarah was the image of Hannah, the same delicate nose, the same determined chin. How could he risk leaving them orphaned? Yet how could he abandon their mother when she might be within reach? Solomon didn't sleep again that night, his mind circling through possibilities, risks, scenarios. By dawn, as the camp stirred to life around him, he had made his decision. Isaiah, he called softly as the older man emerged from his shelter. I need to ask something of you. They spoke briefly, intensely as the column prepared to resume its march. When they finished, Isaiah embraced Solomon tightly. May God go with you, the older man said, whatever happens. Solomon knelt before his children, gathering them close. Papa has to do something important today, he told them, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions within. You'll stay with Uncle Isaiah for a little while. Are you going to find Mama? James asked, his young face lighting with hope. Solomon nodded, unable to lie to his son. I'm going to try. You be brave for me and take care of your sister until I come back with Mama. Can you do that? James nodded solemnly. I promise, Papa. Sarah clung to Solomon, her small arms around his neck. Don't go, Papa, she whispered. Solomon held her tightly, breathing in her sweet child scent, memorizing the feel of her in his arms. I have to, sweet pea, but I'll come back. You stay with James and Uncle Isaiah. They'll keep you safe. As the column moved out, Solomon carried Sarah for the first mile, then reluctantly handed her to Isaiah. Remember what we discussed, he said quietly. Isaiah nodded grimly. 1 hour after it starts. No longer. Solomon dropped gradually toward the rear of the column, watching his children march ahead with Isaiah, their small figures growing more distant with each step. The pain of separation was physical, but he forced himself forward. If his information was correct, if Hannah truly was with the Confederate force, this might be his only chance to reunite his family. By mid-morning, the column had entered a narrow valley flanked by wooded hills, perfect terrain for an ambush or confrontation. The Union officers sensed it too, cavalry scouts ranging wider, infantry moving into protective formations around the refugee column. Solomon's nerves were stretched to breaking point, every sense heightened as he scanned the ridgelines for movement. Just when he thought Isaiah's information might have been wrong, a single rider appeared on the road ahead, bearing a white flag. The column halted. Colonel Harmon rode forward to meet the rider, while Lieutenant Wilson ordered the refugees to cluster tightly together, surrounded by armed soldiers. Solomon worked his way to the edge of the group, positioning himself where he could see the parley while remaining inconspicuous. The Confederate messenger spoke with Colonel Harmon for several minutes, occasionally gesturing toward the refugee column. Finally, the colonel nodded grimly, and the messenger rode away. Harmon returned to the column, his face set in hard lines as he conferred with his officers. After a few minutes, Lieutenant Wilson addressed the refugees. There's a Confederate detachment ahead that claims some of you are escaped slaves from specific plantations in Georgia," he announced. "They're demanding your return under the fugitive slave laws." A murmur of fear ran through the group. "Colonel Harmon has refused, of course," Wilson continued. "You're all under United States military protection now, but be prepared for possible trouble. Stay together, stay calm." As the column cautiously resumed its march, Solomon caught Isaiah's eye across the crowd. The older man nodded slightly, shifting to keep James and Sarah deeper within the protective formation. They rounded a bend in the road, and suddenly the Confederate force was visible ahead. Perhaps 20 mounted men in grey and butternut formed in a line across the road. Behind them, just visible, was a wagon with a canvas cover. Hannah. Solomon knew with sudden certainty that she was in that wagon, brought along to identify specific runaways. His heart hammered against his ribs as the distance between the two forces gradually diminished. Colonel Harmon halted the column about 100 yards from the Confederate line. The Union cavalry formed a protective screen while infantry took positions around the refugees. For several tense minutes, nothing happened. Then a Confederate officer rode forward, again under a white flag. This parley lasted longer, voices occasionally rising loud enough for Solomon to catch fragments. Legal property under Confederate law. Emancipation Proclamation. Specific individuals, not the entire group. Non-negotiable. Finally, the Confederate officer gestured toward the wagon, which rolled forward. The canvas cover was pulled back, and Solomon's heart stopped. Hannah sat in the wagon bed, her splinted ankle extended before her, her face drawn with pain, but her back straight with dignity. Beside her stood a man Solomon recognized with loathing, Blackwood's overseer Jenkins, a notorious brute known for his cruelty. The Confederate officer was pointing toward the refugee column now, clearly demanding specific individuals. Colonel Harmon shook his head repeatedly, his posture unyielding. Suddenly, Jenkins yanked Hannah to her feet, causing her to cry out as weight fell on her broken ankle. He held a pistol to her head, shouting something Solomon couldn't quite hear. The Union officers stiffened, hands moving to weapons. The tension in the air was palpable, a powder keg waiting for a spark. This was it, the moment Isaiah had predicted. In the confusion of confrontation, Solomon might reach Hannah. But to do so meant breaking from the protection of the Union lines, exposing himself, perhaps triggering open conflict. Solomon glanced one last time toward Isaiah and his children, now barely visible in the center of the refugee group. Then he turned back toward Hannah, made his choice, and began moving quietly toward the edge of the formation, using other refugees as cover. Just as he reached the perimeter, a commotion erupted at the parley line. Jenkins was shouting, gesticulating wildly with his pistol. The Confederate officer seemed to be trying to calm him, while Colonel Harmon and his staff had backed their horses away slightly, hands hovering near their sidearms. In that moment of distraction, Solomon broke from the Union lines, moving in a low crouch toward a drainage ditch that ran alongside the road. He slid into it, crawling rapidly forward, using the minimal cover to approach the Confederate position from an angle. Behind him, shouts arose as his absence was noticed. Ahead, the confrontation continued, all attention focused on the standoff between the officers. No one was watching for a single man approaching through the tall grass beside the road. Solomon reached a point about 30 yards from the wagon, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain it would give him away. Hannah was still standing in the wagon bed, Jenkins beside her with the pistol, both focused on the parley. Taking a deep breath, Solomon broke from cover, running in a low crouch toward the rear of the wagon. 20 yards, 10, 5. A shout went up from one of the Confederate soldiers. "Runner, left flank!" Everything happened at once. The Confederate line shifted, horses wheeling toward the disturbance. Jenkins turned, his pistol swinging away from Hannah. and Solomon, with a final desperate surge, reached the wagon and vaulted over its side. He collided with Jenkins, the momentum carrying both men over the opposite side of the wagon onto the ground. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the air as they fell. Solomon landed on top, driving his fist into Jenkins' face with all the force of years of oppression behind it. The overseer went limp, stunned, or unconscious. Solomon scrambled to his feet, turning back toward the wagon where Hannah stood frozen in shock. "Solomon," she whispered, as if unable to believe her eyes. "Come on," he urged, reaching for her. Hannah moved toward him, hobbling on her splintered ankle, her face transforming from shock to desperate joy. Their hands were just about to touch when the first gunshot rang out. For one terrible moment, Solomon thought Hannah had been hit, but she continued reaching for him, and it was only when her expression changed to horror that he realized the bullet had found him instead. A strange coldness spread through his left side, followed by searing pain. He looked down to see a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Still, he grasped Hannah's outstretched hand, pulling her from the wagon. More shots rang out, the Confederate and Union lines exchanging fire now. Solomon half-carried, half-dragged Hannah toward the drainage ditch. Each step an agony as blood soaked his side. They fell into the shallow depression together, Hannah crying out as her ankle was jostled. "You're hurt," she gasped, seeing the blood. "Just a graze," Solomon lied, pressing his hand against the wound. "Can you move?" Hannah nodded grimly. "If it means freedom, I can fly." Together they began crawling along the ditch, away from the escalating firefight. Solomon's vision blurred, his strength ebbing with each yard they covered. But Hannah was beside him, her presence alone somehow keeping him moving when his body screamed for surrender. They had covered perhaps 50 yards when Isaiah appeared at the edge of the ditch, rifle in hand. His eyes widened at the sight of Solomon's blood-soaked shirt. "You damn fool," he muttered, jumping down beside them. "I told you 1 hour, not 5 minutes. Couldn't wait." Solomon gasped, a weak smile crossing his face despite the pain. "The children. Safe with that young lieutenant. Come on, both of you. The Union boys are holding the Rebs back, but not for long." With Isaiah's help, they made their way back toward the Union lines, keeping low in the ditch. Solomon's strength was fading rapidly, the world growing dim around the edges. Only Hannah's hand in his, and the thought of his children kept him conscious. As they neared the Union position, soldiers reached down to help them up from the ditch. Solomon heard Lieutenant Wilson's voice giving orders, felt himself being lifted onto a stretcher. Hannah's hand was torn from his as they were separated for medical attention. "Hannah," he called weakly. "My wife." "She's right here," Wilson assured him. "We've got her. You just hold on, Solomon. That's an order." As consciousness slipped away, Solomon's last thought was of his family. Hannah found, the children safe, all of them free at last. If this was to be his final act in life, it was enough. More than enough. Freedom had come at a terrible price, but as darkness claimed him, Solomon Reed knew that his children would never know the lash, never be sold away from those they loved. They would live as free people in a free country, and that was worth any price, even his life. Solomon drifted in and out of consciousness, fragments of reality interspersed with fever dreams. Sometimes he heard voices, urgent professional tones discussing bullet fragments and infection. Sometimes he felt hands on his body, changing bandages, spooning broth between his lips. And sometimes in the clearer moments he felt a smaller hand holding his own. Hannah's hand, he was certain, though he couldn't seem to open his eyes to confirm it. Time lost all meaning. Days might have passed, or weeks. The pain in his side ebbed and flowed like a tide, occasionally receding enough for brief moments of lucidity before surging back to drag him under again.